Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into the grimy, chaotic, and absolutely miserable world of historical pirates. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this. You might be picturing wild adventures, glittering treasure chests, and a talking parrot on your shoulder. The stories they spin in the warm, ale-scented glow of taverns. But the truth? It's darker, smellier, and filled with more screaming than you signed up for. It's a life built on violence, fear, and a profound, soul-crushing lack of hope. All right, let's begin. The story we're diving into isn't about a dashing hero. It's about you. Let's place you on the deck of a merchant ship, the Westerly Wind. You're not a pirate, not yet. You're an honest sailor, maybe 19 years old. Let's call you Thomas Finn. This isn't the grand adventure you dreamed up back in that Bristol pub, but it's a good life. It's a life with order, with a captain bound by admiralty law, and with the promise of pay and a future that is about to end. It's a Tuesday. The sun is a merciless, brassy glare on a placid sapphire sea. The pitch is bubbling in the seams of the deck, and the air is thick with the familiar, comforting smells of tar and salt. You're high up in the rigging, mending a frayed line, your world a dizzying, rhythmic sway of wood, canvas, and an endless blue sky. It's peaceful, almost divine. Then you see it, a black speck on the horizon. You watch as it grows with an unnatural speed. Down on the deck, the lookout, a wiry old salt named Peters, gives the cry, "Sail ho! Off the port bow!" Your captain, a stout, red-faced man named Davies, raises his spyglass. A knot of tension forms among the crew below. You know what every merchantman knows. In these waters, you are prey. Your 4 small cannons are for show, not for a real fight. "What colors does she fly?" someone shouts up. The captain lowers his glass, and you can see the color drain from his face, even from your high perch. The words he speaks are quiet, but they carry across the deck like a death knell. "She flies no colors." A ship with no colors is a ship that doesn't follow the rules of nations. Out here, that means one thing. As the vessel draws closer, its form becomes horrifyingly clear. It's a sloop, built for speed and aggression, low, sleek, and dark like a shark. And then, as if sensing your collective dread, a flag is hoisted to its masthead. It is not the flag of England, or Spain, or France. It is a banner of pure, stark black, and on it, a symbol that turns the blood in your veins to ice. A white skull, grinning with empty sockets, above 2 crossed bones. The Jolly Roger. The romantic tales did not prepare you for this. That flag is not a symbol of adventure. It's a declaration on war on your entire world. It promises no mercy, only a swift, brutal end. Panic explodes on your deck. Men who have faced down Atlantic storms now scramble like frightened rats. Captain Davies roars feudal orders. "To arms! Load the cannons! Show them English steel, lads!" But it's hopeless. The pirate ship dances around you, impossibly agile. A puff of white smoke blossoms from its bow, and a second later the air beside you screams. Wood splinters from the mainmast, showering the deck. One of those splinters catches Peters in the throat. He makes a soft, wet sound and tumbles from the rigging into the sea. Your world dissolves into a cacophony of hellish noise, the roar of cannons, the crack of muskets, and over it all, the screaming. Their first volley is aimed at your rigging, a calculated act of cruelty designed to cripple you. Sails tear, ropes snap, and the great wooden yards crash down, crushing men beneath their weight. They are alongside you before you can even mount a defense. Grappling hooks fly, biting deep into your railings. And then they come. Forget the handsome rogues from the stories. These are demons. Their faces are sun-blackened and scarred. Many are missing eyes, limbs, or teeth.
They scream guttural roars of pure bloodlust as they swarm over your rails. You are frozen in the rigging, a spectator to the butchering of your world. You see your first mate cut down. You see your captain fire his pistols before being overwhelmed, a cutlass opening him from chest to belly. Blood, shockingly red, slicks the clean decks. The air, once salty and fresh, is now thick with the coppery stench of slaughter and acrid smoke. The fighting is brief and one-sided. Within minutes, it's over. Those of you who aren't dead are on your knees, hands bound, cold steel at your necks. You're dragged down, your arms wrenched behind your back, and thrown onto the deck amongst the other survivors. You're forced to kneel in the blood of your friends. The pirate captain steps forward. He's tall and gaunt, with a black beard braided into thin plaits, each tipped with a smoldering fuse. He looks like a devil wreathed in his own private hell. His one good eye, the other a milky, dead orb, surveys you with chilling amusement. This is Silas Croft, a name whispered in terror across the Caribbean. "Well, well, look at this fine flock of lambs, ready for the shearing." He walks down the line, scrutinizing each of you. He's assessing your value. He stops in front of you. You're 19, strong from years of hauling ropes. He grabs your hair, yanks your head back. "This one's Hale." He shoves you forward and moves on. He selects 5 others. The rest, the older, the wounded, are deemed useless. "Quartermaster," Croft barks, "deal with the refuge." The quartermaster, a man called Blackwood, nods grimly. His men grab the remaining prisoners. You know what's coming. You squeeze your eyes shut, but you can't shut out the sounds, the pleas for mercy, cut short by the wet thud of a club or the crack of a pistol, followed by a splash. When you open your eyes again, your crew is gone. Your ship is being plundered. Your life, as you knew it, is finished. You and the other 5 are shoved toward the railing, forced to jump onto the deck of the pirate sloop, the Sea Serpent. As you land on the filthy, blood-stained planks of your new home, you look back one last time at the westerly wind. They're setting it ablaze. Flames lick up the mast, a funeral pyre for your freedom, for your future, for the man you used to be. The stories tell of adventure. They don't tell you that it begins by watching your world burn. They don't tell you that your new life starts with you no longer being a man, but a piece of property, a slave. This is your first day as a pirate. And the lessons are only going to get more brutal from here.
Part 2. An Education in Misery. The Sea Serpent was not a ship. It was a floating circle of hell. If the westerly wind had been a place of order and predictable routine, the pirate sloop was a chaotic, stinking, overcrowded den of depravity and despair. Every surface seemed to be coated in a layer of grime, a greasy mixture of tar, spilt rum, food waste, and filth of a more personal nature. The air below decks was a physical assault, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the smells of unwashed bodies, stale bilge water, rot, and the ever-present cloying sweetness of cheap, strong rum. My new life began immediately. There was no period of adjustment, no moment to grieve. Blackwood, the quartermaster, whose authority was second only to Captain Croft, put us to work. We were now the lowest form of life on this vessel, lower even than the ship's rats, which were at least free to scurry where they pleased. "You're on the account now, lads," Blackwood growled, his voice a low rumble. "But you ain't one of us, not yet. You're pressed men. That means you work twice as hard and get none of the spoils. Your share is the air you breathe and the scraps you eat. Cross me, shirk your duty, and I'll give you a taste of the cat. Is that understood?" We mumbled our assent, eyes downcast. The cat he referred to was the cat o' nine tails, a whip whose knotted cords could strip a man's back to the bone. I had seen its work on a naval vessel once. The memory was enough to ensure my complete and terrified obedience. My first task was to help swab the decks. It was not the clean, orderly swabbing of the merchant service. Here it meant using a coarse holystone to scrub away the blood of my own crewmates, a task of such profound psychological cruelty that it felt like a deliberate breaking of my spirit. As I worked, my back screaming in protest, the pirates, the true crew, lounged about, drinking, gambling with dice made from human knuckle bones, and sharpening their weapons. They watched us with a mixture of contempt and amusement, occasionally flicking a wad of spit in our direction or kicking our buckets over for sport. The days that followed blurred into a seamless nightmare of grueling labor and constant gnawing fear. From before dawn until long after dusk, we were worked like beasts of burden. We hauled ropes until our hands were raw and bleeding, climbed the rigging in treacherous weather, manned the bilge pumps in the stinking darkness of the hold, and performed every foul, back-breaking task the regular crew deemed beneath them. Laziness was not tolerated. A moment's rest would earn a cuff from a passing pirate, or worse, the attention of Blackwood, whose fists were like blocks of granite. One of the other pressed men, a young fellow from my ship named Samuel, made the mistake of complaining about the ache in his back. Blackwood overheard him. Without a word, he seized Samuel by the collar, dragged him to the mainmast, and tied him to it. He produced the cat o' nine tails from his belt. "Idleness is a disease," Blackwood announced to the assembled crew, his voice cold and flat. "And this is the cure." The first lash sounded like a pistol shot. Samuel screamed, a high, thin sound that was quickly choked off. The whip fell again and again, 9 times in total. When Blackwood was done, Samuel's back was a mangled ruin of bloody flesh. He was cut down and left to lie on the deck, his whimpers the only sound in the sudden silence. No one offered him a drop of water or a word of comfort. Mercy was a foreign currency on this ship. This was the law of the pirates, a simple, brutal code of discipline. Yet, paradoxically, I soon discovered that this floating tyranny was governed by a strange and rigid form of democracy. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I saw the entire crew gathering on the main deck. Captain Croft stood before them, not as an unquestioned commander, but as a leader seeking consensus. "We're low on water, and our provisions are turning. There's a Spanish trade route 2 days' sail to the south. Rich pickings, but their galleons are often escorted by men of war. Or we can head for Tortuga. We can resupply, spend our coin, and find easier prey amongst the French merchantmen. The choice is yours. We put it to a vote." A vote? On the westerly wind, Captain Davies's word was law. To question his destination would have been mutiny. Here, every man, every filthy, louse-ridden, murderous pirate had a say. They argued, they debated, some shouting for the immediate gratification of Tortuga's taverns and brothels, others for the potential riches of the Spanish route. After an hour of raucous discussion, Blackwood called for a show of hands. Tortuga won. Croft simply nodded, accepting the will of his crew without argument. Later, a grizzled old pirate with a wooden leg and a face like a sea chart, who they called Jedediah, saw me watching with bewildered eyes. He hobbled over, a noxious cloud of pipe smoke preceding him. "See that, boy?" he rasped, gesturing with his pipe stem. "That's the pirate's way. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment. Every man gets an equal share of fresh provisions and strong liquor. We choose our own captain, and we can dispose of him just as easy. It's all laid down in the articles." He pointed to a sheet of parchment nailed to the captain's cabin door. It was covered in crude handwriting and signed at the bottom with a series of scrawls and marks. The Articles of Agreement. It was their constitution, a contract of thieves. Jedediah explained the basics. 1 share of any plunder for a regular crewman, 1.5 shares for the quartermaster and the ship's master, 2 shares for the captain, special compensation for injuries sustained in battle, 100 pieces of 8 for the loss of a finger, 800 for a leg. There were rules against fighting on board. Disputes were to be settled ashore with sword and pistol, against bringing women onto the ship, and a strict curfew for lights and drinking below decks to prevent fire. "We are free men here, boy," Jedediah said, a flicker of pride in his rheumy eyes. "Brothers of the coast, we bow to no king, no governor, only to the articles and the will of the crew." His words were a bitter poison in my ears. Free? They had stolen my freedom, murdered my friends, and condemned me to a life of brutal servitude. Their democracy was a privilege reserved for the brotherhood of killers. As a pressed man, I had no vote. I had no right to a share. I was not their brother, I was their property. Until I either died or proved my worth in battle and willingly signed their damnable articles, I was nothing. The days turned into weeks. The hope of rescue, which had been a small flickering candle in the darkness of my soul, began to gutter and die. No ship that saw the Jolly Roger would dare approach. My world shrank to the dimensions of this 200-ton wooden prison. My companions were the 50 or so cutthroats who made up the crew and the 5 other pressed men who shared my fate. We were a miserable, haunted bunch, clinging to each other for a sliver of the sanity we had left. Sleep offered no escape. We were not afforded hammocks. Our sleeping quarters were the damp, cramped forecastle, a sliver of space in the ship's bow. We slept on the bare, filthy deck, crammed together like salted fish in a barrel. The air was stagnant, thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and bilge rot. Rats, bold and fat, scurried over us in the dark. The constant motion of the ship, the groaning of the timbers, and the snores and drunken mutterings of the pirates were a constant backdrop to my fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep. I would dream of my home, of the green hills of England, and wake with tears on my face to the cold, hard reality of my new life. I was slowly coming to understand the profound truth of this existence. This was not a temporary state. There was no going back. The life I had known was a distant shore I could never reach again. To survive in this world, the old Thomas Finn would have to die, and I was terrified of what might be born from his ashes. Part 3. The Sustenance of Hell. If the labor broke our backs and the fear corroded our spirits, it was the food and drink that rotted us from the inside out. On a merchant vessel, provisions were carefully rationed, but they were at least, at the start of a voyage, wholesome. On the Sea Serpent, the concept of wholesome food was a laughable fantasy. The pirates' approach to provisioning was a violent acquisition followed by slow decay. Our daily ration was a study in gastronomic horror. The staple was salted meat, either beef or pork, which had been stored in barrels for months, sometimes years. When the cook, a one-armed...
Part 4. The Butcher's Bill. Abel Gristle was a man who seemed to have been carved from rotten wood and stitched together with tarred twine. He was skeletal and thin, with a long beak-like nose and eyes that were perpetually narrowed in a squint of cruel assessment. He had been a barber surgeon in the back alleys of London, a place where the line between healing and butchery was thin and often crossed. On the Sea Serpent, that line had been erased entirely. He was not a healer, he was a craftsman, and his medium was human flesh and bone. His title was surgeon, but his role was tormentor. His sanctuary, the sickbay, was a small windowless cabin in the stern of the ship that stank of stale blood, disease, and the strange herbal concoctions he was always brewing. The walls were lined with shelves holding a terrifying array of tools, saws with rust-pitted teeth, wicked-looking hooks, knives of various sizes, forceps, and cauterizing irons. There was no concept of hygiene. His instruments were wiped clean on a filthy rag and used on man after man. Infection, what Gristle called the rot, was almost guaranteed. In the face of the scurvy epidemic, Gristle was largely powerless. His medical knowledge was a mishmash of ancient theories about the body's humors and quack remedies. He prescribed foul-tasting elixirs made from boiled seaweed and gunpowder, or performed bloodletting with leeches he kept in a slimy jar, believing the disease was caused by an excess of bad blood. His treatments did nothing to halt the disease. They only weakened the suffering men further. But it was in the realm of physical injury that Gristle's true nature was revealed. The daily life of a pirate was filled with accidents. Men fell from the rigging, were crushed by shifting cargo, or were injured in drunken brawls. These injuries were Gristle's canvas. My first experience of his work came when a pirate named Finn, a burly Irishman who had lost 3 fingers in a fight, slipped on the deck during a storm, and his leg was caught and shattered by a loose cannon. His screams of agony were chilling. He was carried, writhing, to Gristle's cabin. The rest of the crew gathered outside, a morbid audience drawn by the promise of spectacle. Gristle examined the leg, his thin lips pursed. "The bone's a mess of splinters," he pronounced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "It'll have to come off. The rot will set in otherwise." Thin, his face pale with sweat and terror, begged, "No, Doc, no, please, just set it. I can't lose my leg." "Would you rather lose your life?" Gristle countered coldly. He turned to his assistant. "Bring the rum and the saw." There was no anesthesia. There was only rum. Finn was given a leather strap to bite down on, and a full bottle of the raw spirit was poured down his throat. 2 burly pirates were tasked with holding him down on the bloody operating table. I stood near the doorway, unable to look away, my stomach a cold, tight knot. Gristle took up his saw. It was a simple carpenter's saw, better suited for wood than for bone. He did not say a word of comfort. He simply placed the blade against Finn's thigh, just above the knee, and began to cut. The sound is something I will carry to my grave. It was a wet, ragged, grating noise, punctuated by Finn's muffled, unholy screams, which were distorted by the leather strap between his teeth. His body convulsed on the table, a desperate, futile struggle against the unendurable pain. The smell of blood filled the small cabin, thick and nauseating. Gristle worked with a detached, methodical focus, his face spattered with red. When the saw finally broke through the bone, there was a sickening crack. The leg, now severed, was tossed into a corner with a wet slap. But the ordeal was not over. The stump was a gushing fountain of blood. Gristle took a cauterizing iron from a small brazier, its tip glowing a malevolent orange red. The hiss and smell of cooking flesh as he pressed it to the wound was the final horror. Finn, who had been screaming, went mercifully silent as he fainted. He died 3 days later from a raging fever, his body consumed by Gristle's rot. He was just one of many. To be sent to Gristle's cabin was often a death sentence. We pressed men learned to hide our injuries, to bind our own wounds in secret, to suffer in silence rather than face the surgeon's cure. As the scurvy tightened its grip, the ship became a charnel house. At least a dozen men were now completely incapacitated, their bodies bloated and rotting. Their teeth lay on the deck where they had fallen out. The stench of their decay was inescapable. Croft and Blackwood looked on with cold pragmatism. A sick pirate was a useless pirate, a drain on precious resources. The crew's morale plummeted. The usual boisterous energy was replaced by a sullen, fearful silence. The healthy men looked at the sick as if they were already ghosts, and the sick looked back with eyes full of despair and accusation. It was during this time that my own gums began to bleed. The terror was a cold hand gripping my heart. I hid it as best I could, rinsing my mouth with salt water when no one was watching. I chewed my weevil-infested biscuit with excruciating care, trying not to aggravate the tender, swollen flesh. I forced myself to work, to climb the rigging even when my joints screamed in protest and black spots danced in my vision. To show weakness was to sign my own death sentence. To be sent to Gristle with the scurvy was to be subjected to his useless, painful remedies until I either died of the disease or of his treatment. Every day was a battle. I watched my fellow pressed men. 2 of them were now in the advanced stages of the disease, their bodies beginning the slow, horrifying process of collapse. They were no longer forced to work. They were simply left in a corner of the deck to die. No one spoke to them. No one offered them water. They were already dead. This, I realized, was the true horror of a pirate's life. It wasn't the fear of a Navy frigate appearing on the horizon, nor the terror of battle. It was the slow, inexorable decay. It was the certainty that your life was cheap, disposable, and that you would die far from home, in filth and agony, without a single soul to mourn your passing. The glitter of gold was a distant, mocking lie. The reality was a slow death from rot, with only a butcher to oversee your final moments. The romantic tales never mentioned the taste of your own blood, the loosening of your teeth, the stench of your own body turning against itself. They never described the sound of a saw cutting through a man's bone. They never captured the absolute soul-crushing despair of knowing that there was no escape, not from the ship, not from the sickness, not from the all-consuming nightmare that was your life.
Part 6. The Weight of the Mark. My mark on the articles, the crude X that had replaced my name, was a brand burned not onto parchment, but onto my very soul. It changed everything and nothing. I was still on the Sea Serpent, still surrounded by the same 50-odd cutthroats, still breathing the same foul air. But I was no longer their slave. I was now their brother. The transformation was as swift as it was hollow. The kicks and cuffs ceased. The orders softened from snarled commands to gruff requests. Men who had once looked through me as if I were a ghost now nodded as I passed. Jedediah, the old pirate with the wooden leg, took it upon himself to be my mentor in this new life. "You got the sea in your blood, lad," he rasped one afternoon, showing me how to properly load and prime a flintlock pistol. The weapon felt heavy and cold in my hand, a lump of latent death. "But you've got the softness of the merchant service in you yet. That'll get you killed. Out here, you ain't got lords and laws. You've got steel, powder, in your own 2 hands. A moment's hesitation is a moment for another man to put his blade in your gut." He taught me the brutal arithmetic of pirate combat. It was not the fencing of gentlemen, but a close, savage business of hacking, stabbing, and gouging. He made me practice with a cutlass against a wooden dummy, shouting insults whenever my form was clumsy. "Faster! Harder! He ain't gonna die of boredom, boy! You're not dancing with a milkmaid!" I learned to strip and clean a musket, to gauge the wind before throwing a grappling hook, to recognize the silhouettes of different naval vessels on the horizon. I learned the 100 little skills that kept a man alive in this bloody trade. With each lesson, I could feel a part of the old Thomas Finn, the boy who dreamed of charts and trade routes, being chipped away, replaced by something harder and colder. I was given a hammock, a share of the fresh provisions, and my daily pint of rum, now as a right rather than a ration of necessity. I even cast my first vote. Croft had proposed we hunt along the coast of Hispaniola, a rich ground for French traders.
Another faction, led by a fearsome, scarred pirate named Boone, argued for the Carolinas, where the English ships were fatter, albeit better defended. When Blackwood called for the vote, I stood among the others, a participant in their savage democracy. My heart pounded. The choice felt momentous, a formal declaration of my new allegiance. I thought of the English ships flying the flag of my homeland. To vote to attack them felt like the ultimate treason. I raised my hand with Boone's faction, choosing to prey on the French. It was a coward's choice, a pathetic attempt to cling to a loyalty that was already dead, but it was the only defiance I had left. The Carolinas won the vote anyway. A week later, we spotted our prey, a heavy English brigantine. My stomach turned to a cold, hard stone. As we ran up the Jolly Roger and fired a shot across her bow, I saw the panic on her decks, the scramble of men who looked just like my old crewmates on the westerly wind. This time, I was not a terrified captive. I was handed a pistol and a cutlass and ordered to join the first wave of boarders. Jedediah clapped me on the shoulder, his breath a foul wave of rum and pipe smoke. "Show 'em what you're made of, lad. Let 'em taste pirate steel. No quarter." The command, "no quarter," meant no mercy, no prisoners. It was a black flag action. The sheer, calculated butchery of it froze my blood. As I swarmed over the railing with the others, my mind was a maelstrom of horror and self-loathing. I was the demon now. I was the nightmare that haunted the dreams of honest sailors. The fighting was a blur of screams, gunpowder smoke, and the wet, percussive clang of steel on steel. I moved through it in a daze, not attacking, but parrying, using my blade only to turn aside the desperate thrusts of the English sailors. I could not bring myself to kill. I was a phantom in the battle, a ghost going through the motions. Then, a young sailor, his face smeared with soot and terror, lunged at me. He tripped on a coil of rope, sprawling at my feet. His sword skittered away. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with the certainty of his own death. He was helpless, utterly at my mercy. Behind me, Boone roared, "Finish him, boy! Don't stand there gawking!" The entire world narrowed to the space between my cutlass and the boy's terrified face. This was the true test. My life as a pirate would be measured in this single moment. To spare him would be to reveal the softness Jedediah had warned me about, to mark myself as a traitor in their midst. My own life would be forfeit. I raised the cutlass. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. I saw myself in him. I saw the westerly wind. I saw the life that had been stolen from me. And a wave of pure black rage washed over me. Rage at Croft, at Blackwood, at Boone, at the sea, at the God who had abandoned me to this hell. I brought the cutlass down. Not on the boy. With all my strength, I slammed the flat of the blade against the side of his head. The impact was a dull thud. He slumped to the deck, unconscious but alive. "He's worth more alive," I found myself shouting, the words tearing from my throat, raw and unfamiliar. "We can sell him in Tortuga." Boone stared at me for a second, his brutish face a mask of confusion. Then he grinned, a flash of yellow teeth in his black beard. "The boy's got a head for business," he bellowed, before turning to cleave his axe into the skull of another sailor. I had saved a life, but I had done it by putting a price on it. I had commodified a man's freedom, just as mine had been. It was not an act of mercy. It was a business transaction. And in that moment, I knew I was truly lost. After the brigantine was looted and its crew slaughtered, save for my captive, we sailed for Tortuga. The famed pirate haven was not a town, but a festering wound on the lip of the Caribbean. A chaotic, sprawling collection of grog shops, gambling dens, and brothels thrown up without plan or purpose. The air hung thick with the smells of cheap rum, cooking pig, sweat, and despair. There was no law here but the law of the blade. We divided the plunder on the deck before going ashore. My share, my first true pirate share, came to 200 pieces of 8 and a handful of English shillings. The silver coins felt like burning coals in my hand.
This was my payment for participating in the murder of my countrymen. The crew exploded into the town in a riot of drunken debauchery. They drank until they collapsed. They gambled away their shares on the turn of a card. They spent their blood money on the fleeting, paid-for comfort of women whose eyes were as empty as my own. I followed them into a tavern, the noise and the press of bodies overwhelming. I saw the boy I had saved being sold to a grim-faced planter for a pittance. His eyes met mine for a second across the crowded room, and the look in them was not gratitude, but pure, bottomless hatred. I sat in a corner, drinking my rum, the silver coins a heavy lump in my pocket. This was the pirates' reward. This was the freedom they cherished. The freedom to drink themselves into oblivion, to squander their fortune, to forget the blood on their hands for a few short hours before returning to the sea to spill more. It wasn't freedom. It was a frantic, desperate race toward the grave. Part 7. The Unmaking of a Man. Weeks in Tortuga bled one into the next, a ceaseless tide of rum and violence. I saw a man stabbed to death over a spilled drink. I saw Jedediah lose his last remaining silver in a rigged dice game and nearly kill the cheat before Blackwood intervened. I watched the crew, my brothers, drink and fight and fornicate their way through their fortunes until they were broke and mean, itching to get back to sea, not for adventure, but to refill their empty purses. The cycle was as predictable as the tides: violence, plunder, debauchery, and then more violence. I held on to my share, spending only what was necessary for food and drink. The hoard of silver felt like an anchor weighing me down. It was proof of my damnation, and I could not bring myself to part with it. I was becoming a creature of this place. The constant exposure to brutality was like a whetting stone, grinding away my compassion, leaving only a hard, pragmatic edge. I learned to watch men fight to the death without flinching. I learned to ignore the pleas of the beggars and the vacant stares of the indentured servants. Empathy was a liability I could no longer afford. Our return to the Sea Serpent was a grim affair. The crew was hungover, irritable and poor. The ship, which had seemed a prison, now felt like a familiar home. Out on the sea, at least, there was a purpose, however vile. Our next prize was a small French slaver, its hold crammed with human misery. Captain Croft, in a move of what he considered magnanimity, offered the slaves a choice: join his crew or be set free on a nearby deserted island. For them, one form of slavery was much like another. A dozen of the strongest men, their bodies scarred with the brands of their former masters, chose the pirate's life, signing the articles with the same grim acceptance I had. Our floating hell was now a multilingual, multiracial congregation of the damned, united only by our shared desperation. It was during the chase of this slaver that my final hardening occurred. A volley of cannon fire from the French ship sent a shower of splinters across our deck. One of them, a piece of oak as long as my arm, tore through the thigh of a young pirate named